Issue is that everybody nowadays wants to rule 34 everything. There's a tendency, especially recently, to sexualize everything. So yes, I think there was sex and nudity in Tolkien's work, and you listed examples, but the context or how you brought it up, not really sure that that was Tolkien's intention. Points that he seems to be trying to make is that the fan base are a bunch of incels. Of course, incels means involuntarily celibate, and he specifically is kind of deriding the whole concept of Christianity, and this is just in the first 2 paragraphs. So first off, the oldest sect of Christianity, which is derived and connected to the RCC, which we'll call it Catholicism. People hooking that into basically any kind of notions of quote-unquote puritanical ideas or prudish stuff is really, really silly, because that context, what that does is that colors not only Christianity, but that colors specifically the sect of Catholicism, which when you look at the major countries in the world which have the largest amounts of Catholics, sexually they're not very repressed. So the idea that because someone is Christian that they're repressed, this right off the bat, and we're just dealing with the first 2 paragraphs that I'm going to actually read, so that way you can't say I made anything up. But specifically, I can just say off the top of my head, like Brazil has a very high contingent of Catholics, not a repressed country. Spain, high contingent of Catholics, not a repressed country. France, the same. Italy, the same. I don't really want to list all the different countries. We can look at Latin America. We can look at many countries which one of the largest sects that they have of Christianity would be Catholicism. And I would say in most countries worldwide, they're not repressed sexually. So even starting off from that premise is really disingenuous and made up, not true. What really triggered me? Well, what triggered me is just off the top of my head, like starting off. So Tolkien wrote a lot of sex and nudity. Christians thought otherwise. So J.R.R. Tolkien is often thought to be a sexless writer. His Christian fan base seems to think his fantasy land, Middle-earth, was some kind of incel paradise. I'm mystified. Are we talking about the same J.R.R. Tolkien? Because the one I'm reading has a lot of sex and nudity. Say what you said. This is basically the idea behind what you're saying, is that we're imposing our Christianity on Tolkien. But to even say that right off the bat, Tolkien was a hardcore Catholic, which is why I said the things that I said a few minutes ago. Cosmology is fundamentally, once again, his cosmology is fundamentally Christian. Eru, Iluvatar, the Valar, the Maiar, fundamentally from a Christian perspective. Many people may not like that in 2022. Forget about it. I really don't care. It is what it is. And then, of course, what comes up is the whole Sam and Frodo thing, which is old hat, to be quite honest. I'm not going to lie. When I first saw the trilogy, I guess I had my own questions about just how they characterized Sam and Frodo. But at the same time, it kind of brings up the idea that it's impossible for 2 men to be that close in terms of friendship, to be friends that close. And that really is actually kind of like a sickening prospect when you really think about it without a sexual context. The idea that you cannot have a friend to that level, that's kind of sad. So going back to Sam and Frodo for a moment. So the author of the article posits that in Tolkien's work, Sam and Frodo wake up in bed together. So my response to that is nobody cares. This guy goes on to say that Tolkien's world has a sensual beauty. His skies, mountain, and trees are described as naked, like when trees are seen as leafless, but beautiful in their shapely nakedness. You know, the thing is, how did you want him to say that? What did you want him to say? I mean, what was the other way that he should have said that? I'm at a loss here. Then he goes on and he's, firing shots once again at Christianity. So the guy says, there's a flow of embodied energy in Middle Earth that hardly suggests sexlessness, much less Christian body hatred. And like, once again, this is just like he's firing shots where there's no smoke on the other hand. Like, where is this coming from? The only place this is coming from is like these ideas now and these concepts that they try to impose on older literature. They try to impose the thinking of 2022 on older literature. He goes on later on and he's talking about how elves are completely androgynous. And once again, he's like bringing up concepts that don't really seem that they were endemic or they were actually crystallized in Tolkien's work. It's just you're imposing your views of the world on Tolkien. So the guy mentions orcs. So first off, orcs are first mentioned in Beowulf, and they're called Ordnes. And then the word that we commonly use, orcus, is from Latin, and that's for like hell devil. Okay, so here's open quote. So orcs presented Tolkien with a moral dilemma. He attempted to resolve this by proposing several semi-contradictory theories for their origins, and this is from the wiki on orcs. In the Tale of Tunevil, orcs originated as foul broodlings of Melkor who fared abroad doing his evil work, and that's a quote from Tolkien. In the Silmarillion, orcs are East elves of Ari, enslaved, tortured, and bred by Morgoth as Melkor became known. They multiplied like elves and men. Continuing on, Tolkien stated in a 1962 letter to a Mrs. Munsby that orc females must have existed. So I'm going to close quote. In his article, the gentleman posits that orcs must have raped women in order to, quote unquote, replicate. Now, usually in war, women will often be raped historically, but the idea that orcs are necessarily multiplying solely through rape of women is an assumption that the author of this article is making, and it's not something that Tolkien stated directly himself. The main problem with the guy's article is a lot of the stuff that he says is just made up. It's from his mind. And it's really just from his quote-unquote activism and how he thinks the world should be. And his concept or conception regarding Christianity, I mean, he speaks of it as if he knows about Christianity, but it's just surface level nonsense, really. And it's just some kind of CNN or even Fox news bite or sound bite that's completely made up. The author goes on to quote the Tom Bombadil when he says, "You won't find your clothes again." And he goes on to say, "Be glad, my merry friends, and let the warm sunlight heat now heart and limb. Cast off these cold rags, run naked on the grass while Tom goes a-hunting." So I don't really know what that means. And what I'm saying by that is, why does that bother you? And I go back to where I started, Rule 34. Does everything need to have nudity? So the amount of poetic license that one takes when you do the reenactment, or rather you adapt a script or something to actual. The gentleman who writes the article, he goes on later on to talk about how basically he says that Frodo spends the whole plot being raped. And that's not what I really understood, but once again, that's what you're getting from that. He goes on to quote the Silmarillion and says, "Then Sauron stripped from them their disguise, and they stood before him naked and afraid." So the only issue, once again, and the gentleman, he starts off, and his main issue, he's got an axe to grind against Christianity. That, to me, that's like a perfect analogy to the Garden of Eden and the serpent. Because once the serpent tricked Eve, they noticed that they were naked. So that's where that takes me, because I know that Tolkien was coming from that frame point or that state of mind when he wrote that particular passage. It seems maybe that the writer of the article has more of an obsession with forced sex than maybe Tolkien does, even though he brings up a gentleman named Daniel Stride. But the things that they point out, they really seem like a stretch. And even if these things really were in Tolkien's work, why would forced sex be needed? And why would this need to be shown in an adaptation of Tolkien's work? How would that really work? And why would that need to be shown in graphic detail? Once again, we're going back to Rule 34, and it just seems like this need or obsession is really just lust, really. And it's not really so much hooked in on what Tolkien's doing or what any Christians are doing. Used at points, to be quite honest, because he brought up Tolkien's sex life and talked about Tolkien being unhappy. He talked about writers being unhappy. And really, if your position was that the Christian fan base were messing it up for, quote unquote, the rest of basically the non-believers or the quote-unquote regular people, then why would you then switch off and talk about how Tolkien himself and take shots at Tolkien and his sex life if your main position was that it's the bad Christians who are a bunch of incels who are messing up the Rule 34 version of his work? Sincerely improved the writing just putting sex in there. That's just an aside there. But I think also what I want to say is that he goes on to say, and this part I am going to quote, the Christian forces claimed victory. One of the showrunners, Patrick McKay, was asked by Vanity Fair if there will be Game of Thrones style violence and sex. He replied, there would not be. The target demographic, he said, is kids who are 11, 12, and 13. And so an aside, the writer says, well, that includes most Christians. Emotionally, they can seem kind of stunted and a strange aversion to human sexuality. This is a religion that deeply values the idea of being symbolically castrated through body denial, as the Christian scholar and psychologist Philip L. Culbertson once noted. This gentleman, really, I just read it's only takes 7 minutes to read it, but it's just basically a resentment towards Christianity. Because once again, he's just labeling a billion people and projecting his animosity or his feeling, and maybe it comes from how he was raised, I don't know. And why am I psychoanalyzing him? Well, he's psychoanalyzing a billion people he doesn't know. All, if I can sum up everything that I really want to say about the gentleman's position, it would be projection. And outside of that, give me a like, subscribe, share it with a friend and an enemy, and make sure to watch the next video. I'm out.